There is a particular kind of silence that follows a war. It is not the silence of peace. It is something older and more deliberate, the silence of classification, of sealed files, of names that were never entered into the public record, because the work they described was never supposed to be known at all. In the autumn of 1945, as the last formal instruments of surrender were being signed in the Pacific, and the bonfires of celebration burned across Europe and America, thousands of men and women who had spent years doing some of the most intellectually demanding work in the history of organized conflict simply went home. They had been told, in language that was not metaphorical, that what they had done did not exist. They were handed pieces of paper, oath forms, secrecy agreements, legal instruments binding them to silence for as long as national security required, and they signed them. Many of them would keep that silence for the rest of their lives. Some of them are still keeping it, not because they are still alive, most of them are not, but because the silence became structural. It became institutional. It became the architecture of the history books that were written without them. What you were taught about the Second World War, in school, in documentary films, in the popular histories that line the shelves of airport bookshops, is not false, but it is radically, systematically incomplete. The names you know, Turing, Churchill, Eisenhower, Patton, are real people who did real things, but there is an entire parallel history running alongside the one you were taught, populated almost entirely by women that did not make it into the curriculum, not because the women were less important, not because their contributions were marginal or auxiliary or supportive in the diminishing sense that word is usually applied, but because the work they did was classified, because classification by its nature is not applied equally. And because when the secrets were finally, partially released, the institutions that controlled the narrative had already decided who the story was about. This is the story they forgot to teach, or rather the story they chose not to teach. And the distinction between forgetting and choosing is, as we will see, one of the central questions of 20th century intellectual history. 2. Historical context and setting. To understand the scale of what happened, it helps to understand what cryptology was in 1939 and what it became by 1945. In the beginning of the war, the breaking of enemy codes was considered a specialist's discipline, arcane, mathematical, and the province of a small number of academic linguists and puzzle enthusiasts who had been quietly recruited into intelligence services during the interwar years. The British had their government code and cipher school, which had been established after the First World War to study the cipher systems of foreign powers. The Americans had a signal intelligence service, a tiny organization operating out of a building in Washington with a staff that could be counted on 2 hands. The work was considered important but niche. There were not enough people doing it, not enough machines to do it with, and not enough institutional understanding of what it could accomplish. Then the war began in earnest, and everything changed. The Germans had deployed an encryption machine called Enigma. It was not new. A version of it had been patented in the early 1920s and sold commercially. But the military version, as adapted and used by the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine, generated combinations of such complexity that contemporary analysts estimated it would take longer than the age of the universe to crack by brute force alone. There were, in theory, approximately 158 quintillion possible settings for a 3-rotor naval Enigma machine. Every day at midnight, the settings changed. You had 24 hours to read yesterday's traffic before it became inaccessible again. And in those 24 hours, you also had to intercept, transcribe, and begin analyzing whatever new traffic was coming through on the new day's settings. It is important to hold that number for a moment. 158 quintillion, written out 158,962,555,217,806,360,000. That is not a number that can be defeated by patience or by hard work, or by clever guessing. It requires something else entirely. It requires the construction of new kinds of thinking, systematic, probabilistic, layered, and the building of machines that could run through possibilities at mechanical speed, while the human analysts provided the intellectual scaffolding that allowed the machines to know where to start. In Britain, that work was conducted at Bletchley Park, an estate in Buckinghamshire that had been requisitioned by the government and transformed into the central headquarters of British signals intelligence. At its peak, Bletchley Park employed around 10,000 people. Roughly 3/4 of them were women. In the United States, the equivalent operation grew from its pre-war handful of analysts into an organization employing tens of thousands, with the largest facilities located at Arlington Hall in Virginia and at the Naval Communications Annex on Nebraska Avenue in Washington. By 1944, the majority of the workforce in these facilities was female. These are not footnotes. These are the basic demographic facts of the code-breaking enterprise that contributed, in ways now documented and beyond serious historical dispute, to shortening the Second World War by an estimated 2 to 4 years. The work done in these buildings by these people saved, by conservative estimate, millions of lives. The women who did that work were, in the institutional language of the time, typists, clerks, assistants. They processed information, they ran the machines, they performed the supporting functions that allowed the brilliant men at the top to do the real intellectual work. This is the fiction that the history books inherited, and it is exactly wrong. To understand why it is wrong, and why the fiction persisted for so long, we need to look at the specific lives of the specific women who built this enterprise. Because the history of cryptology in the Second World War is in its essential structure a history of women who were given titles that did not reflect their work, salaries that did not reflect their contributions, and credit that, for decades, was given to someone else entirely. We need to understand how classification functions not just as a security mechanism, but as a tool of historical shaping. When information is classified, it does not simply become secret, it becomes absent from the historical record. And an absence in the historical record is not neutral. It is not empty space. It is a space that gets filled by whatever evidence remains available, which means the careers of men, the memoirs of generals, the declassified files that happened to pass through male hands. The structure of classification did not intend in any conspiratorial sense to erase women from history, but it had that effect, and the question of whether an effect without intent still constitutes an injustice is one that serious historians have been wrestling with ever since the files began to open. The files began to open in 1974 in Britain, when Parliament passed the first legislation reducing the secrecy period on government documents from 50 years to 30. Then in the United States, the NSA began a gradual, incomplete, and deeply politicized process of releasing historical materials. The first serious scholarly treatment of Bletchley Park appeared in 1974 with the publication of Frederick Winterbotham's The Ultra-Secret. But Winterbotham's account focused almost entirely on the strategic uses of intelligence, on Churchill, on Eisenhower, on the operational decisions that ultra-intelligence enabled. The people who had actually broken the codes appeared in his account as background. Infrastructure, useful but largely invisible. It would take decades more, until the late 1990s and the early 2000s, before the women who had done the foundational intellectual work began to receive sustained biographical attention. And some of them never did. Their names remain, to this day, essentially unknown outside specialist academic circles. That is the historical context. Now let us talk about the people themselves. 3 key figures and events. Begin with Elizebeth Friedman, because she is in many ways the origin point of American cryptology, and because her story contains within it nearly everything you need to understand about how this history was made and unmade. Elizabeth Smith was born in 1892 in Huntington, Indiana. She studied English literature at Hillsdale College in Michigan then enrolled in graduate school in Old English at the University of Chicago. She was 24 years old, brilliant, unencumbered by institutional affiliation, and possessed of the kind of mind that finds patterns in language instinctively, that cannot look at a sequence of letters without beginning, almost involuntarily, to organize them into meaning. In 1916, she was hired by a man named George Fabian, a wealthy industrialist who had become convinced, as a hobby, as an obsession, that Francis Bacon had written Shakespeare's plays and hidden the proof in a cipher embedded in the original folios. The theory was wrong, but the work of hunting for it was, in a peculiar and indirect way, one of the most consequential hires in the history of American intelligence. At Fabian's estate in Illinois, she met William Friedman, a geneticist who had also been drawn into the cipher hunting project. They worked together. They fell in love. They married. And between them, they essentially invented the modern discipline of cryptanalysis in the United States. William Friedman became the founding figure of the Army's Signal Intelligence Service and is credited, with substantial justification, as the father of American cryptology. He appears in the textbooks. There are buildings named after him. His portrait hangs in NSA facilities. His wife, Elizabeth, who in the 1930s and 1940s broke the cipher systems of Nazi spy networks operating in South America, single-handedly working for the Coast Guard with minimal resources and no institutional prestige, appears in very few of those textbooks. The buildings do not bear her name. What Elizebeth Friedman did between roughly 1940 and 1945 was this. She broke the Enigma encrypted communications of a Nazi intelligence network operating throughout Latin America. The network, known by various names in different national intelligence files, was coordinating German espionage across Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Bolivia. The Nazis believed their communications were unbreakable. They were wrong. Elizebeth Friedman broke them. She then passed the intelligence to the FBI. Edgar Hoover took the credit. Not privately, publicly. He called press conferences. He announced the arrests dozens of Nazi agents across the Western Hemisphere as the product of FBI investigative work. He did not mention the Coast Guard cryptanalyst who had handed him the keys. He did not mention that without her work, there were no keys to present. In his subsequent accounts, the work was described as an FBI operation. In his subsequent accounts, the cryptanalysis had been performed by male FBI agents. Elizebeth Friedman's name did not appear. She could not correct the record. She was under oath of secrecy. She spent years watching Hoover receive commendations for work she had done. She kept her own records, meticulous, private records, in her personal papers, which she eventually donated to the George C. Marshall Foundation. Those papers were first seriously examined by scholars in the early 2000s. Her full contribution to the defeat of Nazi intelligence networks in the Western Hemisphere did not receive thorough public documentation until 2017, when journalist Jason Fagone published his biography of her, The Woman Who Smashed Codes. She had been dead for 35 years. Now move to Agnes Meyer Driscoll. She was born in 1889 in Geneseo, Illinois, and is possibly the greatest cryptanalyst of the first half of the 20th century. The claim sounds extravagant until you examine the evidence, and then it sounds almost modest. Agnes Driscoll studied mathematics and physics at Ohio State University at a time when women who studied mathematics at university were still a novelty sufficiently unusual to attract comment. After graduation, she worked as a music teacher, then joined the Navy during the First World War, and, through a combination of institutional accident and demonstrated brilliance, ended up assigned to the Code and Signal section. She never left. For the next 30 years, she was the intellectual engine of American naval cryptanalysis. In the 1920s, she broke the Japanese naval code called the Red Book, a manual cipher system used for communications between Japanese naval vessels and their shore stations. The break took years of painstaking analysis, It gave American naval intelligence its first systematic access to Japanese naval thinking. In the 1930s, when the Japanese moved to a machine cipher system, she began the process of breaking that. She made critical progress on what would later be called the M1 machine cipher before the work was transferred to a different team. The team that completed the break, which they did, using foundational work she had laid down, received the commendations. During the Second World War, Agnes Driscoll worked on Japanese naval codes at the Naval Communications Annex in Washington. She was known, among the smaller circle of people who knew she existed, as Madam X. She received a Navy commendation for her work, but her name was not associated with the specific breaks she enabled. The classification system that protected her work also protected the institutional convenience of attributing it more vaguely, more collectively, and therefore more safely to the organization as a whole. When she died in 1971, her obituary in the Washington Post described her as a government worker. She had spent 50 years doing work that changed the outcome of naval warfare in 2 world conflicts. She was a government worker. Turn now to Bletchley Park and to the women who worked under Dilly Knox. Alfred Dillwyn Knox, Dilly to the colleagues who admired him and feared him in equal measure, was a classical scholar and papyrologist who had broken Austro-Hungarian naval codes in the First World War and who brought to cryptanalysis the peculiar intensity of a man who had spent his academic life reconstructing ancient texts from fragments. He was difficult, brilliant, and deeply unconventional in his views about who could do this kind of work. While much of the British intelligence establishment reflexively recruited Oxford and Cambridge men, former classicists, mathematicians, chess champions, Dilly Knox specifically sought women. He believed, on the basis of experience rather than theory, that women were better at the particular kind of lateral thinking that machine cipher analysis required. He did not frame this as progressive, he framed it as practical. The results were extraordinary. In early 1940, 2 women who had been recruited to Knox's section broke the Italian Naval Enigma cipher. Their names were Margaret Rock and Mavis Lever. Mavis Lever was 19 years old. She had been studying German at University College London when the war interrupted her studies, and she was recruited, through channels that were themselves classified, to Bletchley Park. She was given no formal explanation of what the work was. She was put in a room with a machine and told, essentially, to think about it. She thought about it. She noticed that none of the encrypted Italian messages contained the letter L. In a random sample of Enigma traffic, the absence of a single letter across a large enough sample is not random. It means the operator who had set the machine that morning had selected a key that, due to the mechanical properties of Enigma, could not encrypt L as L. This observation was the thread. She pulled it. Within months, she had broken the Italian naval Enigma. This was not a marginal contribution. The Italian Navy was actively contesting British supply routes in the Mediterranean. Access to Italian naval communications gave the Royal Navy operational intelligence that was directly decisive in several major engagements, including the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, in which a British fleet, guided by intelligence derived from decrypted Italian signals, ambushed and sank 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, killing over 2,000 Italian sailors and fundamentally altering the naval balance in the Mediterranean for the remainder of the war. The intelligence that enabled that victory came from work done by a 19-year-old who had been studying German literature 6 months earlier, Mavis Lever, later Mavis Beatty, after her marriage to a fellow Bletchley analyst, lived until 2013. She gave interviews. She wrote a book. She received an MBE in 2008, 67 years after the work that arguably earned it. Margaret Rock, her partner in the Italian Enigma break, died in 1983, having received essentially no public recognition whatsoever. Her contribution exists in the classified files and in the memories of the people who worked alongside her, and in the patient reconstruction of scholars who came later. Now consider Genevieve Grotjan, because her story has the quality of a parable, a moment so specific, so documented, and so consequential that it should appear in every history textbook, and yet does not. On September 20, 1940, in a small office at the Army's Signal Intelligence Service in Washington, Genevieve Grotjan was sitting at her desk working through columns of Japanese diplomatic cipher text. She had a mathematics degree from the University of Buffalo and had applied to teach mathematics at a government high school, been told that women were not hired for those positions, and then been offered a position as a junior cryptanalyst instead. She had been at the Signal Intelligence Service for about a year. The cipher she was working on was called Purple by the Americans who were trying to break it. It was used by the Japanese Foreign Ministry for its most sensitive diplomatic communications. It was a machine cipher of considerable sophistication, and a team of American analysts had been working on it for 19 months without a definitive break. They had made progress. They understood certain structural features of the machine, but the key sequence that would allow them to actually read the traffic had not been found. Genevieve Grotjan found it. She noticed a cyclical pattern in the substitution sequences, a mathematical regularity that repeated at a specific interval, revealing the underlying structure of the machine's rotor movement. It was the exact kind of insight that cannot be produced by brute force or by following an established procedure. It required the kind of mind that perceives order in apparent randomness, that sees, in a column of seemingly arbitrary letters, the ghost of a machine's internal logic. When she brought her discovery to her supervisors, the reaction was immediate and extraordinary. The story, as documented by multiple witnesses including the Signal's intelligence officer Frank Rollitt, is that people literally ran through the hallways. There was shouting. There was, and this word appears in the documented accounts, celebration, because what Grotjan had found was the break that unlocked Purple entirely. Within weeks, American cryptanalysts could read Japanese diplomatic traffic in real time. The machine they built to do it, a reconstruction of the Purple cipher device, assembled without ever having seen the original, was replicated and shared with British intelligence. The Purple break was one of the most significant single intelligence events of the Second World War. It gave American and British analysts direct access to the cables sent by Japanese ambassadors and diplomatic missions around the world, including cables from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, who was regularly briefed by the German Foreign Ministry and who sent detailed summaries of those briefings back to Tokyo. Through Purple, American analysts read Hitler's explanations of his operational plans to the Japanese, because the Japanese ambassador then encoded those explanations in a cipher the Americans had broken. Frank Rollitt, the officer who led the team and recognized Grotjan's breakthrough for what it was, received a Legion of Merit for his work on Purple. Genevieve Grotjan received a $25 bonus. She is mentioned in some accounts of the Purple break, absent from others. She is not a household name. We cannot leave this section without discussing the broader institutional context in which all of these women worked, because the individual stories gain their full weight only when they are understood against the backdrop of what 10,000 women were doing simultaneously. At Arlington Hall in Virginia, which became the Army's primary signals intelligence facility after its wartime expansion, women constituted the majority of the analytical workforce by 1943. They were doing not merely the mechanical sorting and transcription that the official narratives later described, but the substantive analytical work of breaking codes, identifying cribs, testing hypotheses, exploiting operator errors, and building the intelligence picture from fragments of intercepted text. They worked in shifts, around the clock, in buildings that were too hot in summer and imperfectly heated in winter, doing work that was by definition invisible because its products were classified, and its processes were never described in the documents that circulated outside the building. The Naval Communications Annex on Nebraska Avenue in Washington employed thousands of WWII women accepted for volunteer emergency service who ran the Bombay machines, the electromechanical computing devices derived from the Polish bomber and refined by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman that systematically tested Enigma settings until a valid decrypt fell out. Running a Bombay was not a mechanical task in the sense of being thoughtless. It required understanding what the machine was doing, knowing when its output was meaningful and when it was noise, and performing the analytical judgments that told the machine operators where to start and what to do with what came out. The women who did this work, thousands of them, working in rotating shifts, maintaining operational security so rigorous that many of them did not know what the machines were actually producing, contributed directly to the ability of Allied naval commanders to read German U-boat traffic, which is to say, to the ability of Allied convoys to cross the Atlantic without being sunk. The Battle of the Atlantic is sometimes described as the war within the war. Between 1939 and 1943, German U-boats sank over 3,000 Allied merchant ships. The supplies those ships were carrying, food, fuel, ammunition, equipment, were the material substance of Britain's ability to continue fighting. If the U-boats had maintained their rate of success through 1944 and 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe would have been different in ways that are genuinely difficult to speculate about. The signals intelligence that allowed Allied commanders to route convoys away from U-boat wolf packs and to direct hunter-killer groups against U-boats whose positions had been revealed by their own communications was produced by the women who ran the Bombays, analyzed the outputs, and maintained the intelligence picture in those buildings in Washington and at Bletchley. There is one more figure who deserves specific attention, both for her intellectual contribution and for the peculiarity of her subsequent career, which is its own kind of historical commentary. Anne Cara Christie joined the Army Signal Intelligence Service in 1942, fresh from a degree in English literature from Russell Sage College in New York. She was 21 years old. She was assigned to work on Japanese Army codes, a different problem from the diplomatic purple cipher, requiring different techniques and different kinds of analytical intuition. She became extraordinarily good at it. By the end of the war, she had risen to lead the team responsible for breaking a Japanese code system that had been considered essentially impenetrable. Her work yielded operational intelligence that directly influenced American military strategy in the Pacific. After the war, the Signal Intelligence Service became the National Security Agency. Anne Cara Christie stayed. She rose through the organization over the next 4 decades, eventually becoming Deputy Director of the NSA in 1980, the highest position a woman had ever held in American intelligence at that point. She received the National Security Medal in 1999. She is one of the few women from the wartime code-breaking enterprise whose career is documented in accessible public records, primarily because her post-war career gave her a public institutional identity that the classification system could not entirely erase. But even her wartime work, the specific analytical contribution that made her career possible, remained largely classified for decades after her retirement. 4. Deeper patterns and analysis. The question that presses itself upon us, when we have followed these lives and these careers to their ends, is not simply why these women were not recognized. That question is real, but it is somewhat too small. It mistakes the effect for the cause. The deeper question is structural. How does a civilization organize its systems of recognition in such a way that the erasure of an entire category of contributors becomes not an act of malice, but a feature of the architecture? Consider the mechanics. Classification is the first mechanism. When work is classified, it cannot be written about. When it cannot be written about, it cannot be included in the journalistic accounts that form the first draft of history. When it is absent from the first draft, it tends to be absent from all subsequent drafts, because historians build on sources, and sources are what survives. The classification system that protected these women's work from enemy intelligence also protected institutional hierarchies from the awkwardness of crediting that work to women who, in the social logic of the 1940s, were not supposed to be capable of it. But classification alone does not explain the pattern. Because when the files were eventually opened, when the secrecy period expired, when the documents were declassified in tranches over the following decades, the women who had done the foundational work did not automatically enter the historical record. The files opened, and what entered the record was shaped by who controlled the narrative of what the files contained. That meant historians. That meant journalists. That meant, in the first generation, mostly male interpreters of mostly male-generated institutional documentation, who found in the files a story about brilliant men who had organized brilliant machines to solve an impossible problem, and who mentioned, where the documents made it unavoidable, that there had been a large number of women employed in various capacities. The social context of the 1940s contributed its own distortion. The women recruited into signals intelligence during the war were recruited specifically because the war had created a labor shortage that made it impossible to staff these facilities with men. They were recruited with explicit promises, some documented, some simply implied by the logic of the situation, that their employment was temporary, for the duration. That phrase occurs throughout the institutional documentation of the period. Women were employed for the duration of the emergency, after which the normal order of things would resume. This framing affected how the women themselves understood their work. It affected how they described it later. Many of them internalized the narrative that they had been useful in a crisis, but that the work itself, the real intellectual work, had been done by the men who ran the institutions. They had been the hands. The men had been the minds. This is not self-deprecation. It is the product of a social environment so thoroughly organized around that assumption that even the people whose work refuted it had difficulty seeing past it. Mavis Beatty, in her later interviews, was notably modest about the scale of her contribution to the Italian Enigma break. She spoke of it as a team effort, which it was, but teams have leaders and followers, generative minds and supporting ones, and in the team that broke the Italian Enigma, Mavis Beatty was the generative mind. She did not quite say so. There is also the question of genre. The history of the Second World War was written, in its canonical forms, as military history. Military history is organized around command, around the decisions of generals and admirals and heads of state. Intelligence history enters that frame as a supporting narrative, the secret work that enabled the men who made decisions. This framing is not merely a narrative convention, it is a genuine reflection of how the relationship between intelligence and command was understood at the time, and to some degree it is accurate. The people who broke Enigma did not themselves command the fleets that sank the Italian cruisers at Cape Matapan. They provided the intelligence that enabled the commanders to make the decisions that led to those fleets being in that position. This is real, and it matters. But the organization of military history around command has consistently produced a narrative in which the enablers of decisions are less important than the makers of decisions and the enablers of the enablers. The analysts who built the intelligence picture that the senior officers then processed into strategic judgment are even less important still. Signals intelligence in the Second World War was specifically organized in such a way that the people who did the primary intellectual work were the furthest from the commanders who used its product. The women at the bomb bays in Washington were 3 steps removed from the admirals in the Atlantic. The connection between their work and its strategic consequence was real but invisible, mediated by layers of classification and institutional process that made it effectively impossible, at the time, for anyone outside the system to know what had actually happened. When the war ended and the time came to write the history, the institutional memory was held by the people who had been closest to the commanders, which meant senior officers, mostly male, with a completely sincere but structurally distorted view of where the intelligence had come from. There is a final pattern worth examining, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable one. It concerns the relationship between intellectual work and institutional recognition in the mid-20th century, and the specific way in which women's intellectual contributions were systematically rendered ambiguous, made to seem more procedural, more mechanical, more rule-following, and less generative than they actually were. This happened at Bletchley Park, in a way that can be directly documented. The work of running the Bombay machines, the electromechanical devices that tested Enigma settings, was described in official documentation as operating the machines. Operating is a word with specific connotations. It implies a relationship to a machine that is reactive, responsive, mechanical. The operator does what the machine requires. But what the Waves and Wrens who ran the Bombays actually did was significantly more than what operating implies. They made analytical judgments about how to interpret the machine's outputs. They identified promising stops, moments when the machine's testing procedure had identified a potential Enigma setting, and they distinguished valid stops from invalid ones through a process that required genuine understanding of the underlying mathematics of Enigma's design. This was not mechanical, it was analytical, but it was called operating, and the word did its work, and it shaped how the contribution was understood, recorded, and eventually remembered. The same process occurred with terms like compiler, clerk, processor, and indexer, titles that appear throughout the administrative records of wartime intelligence facilities, and that, in their ordinary senses, imply purely mechanical or organizational functions, but that in the context of signals intelligence work were applied to women who were doing cryptanalytic analysis. The title did not describe the work. The title described the administrative category that the institution had available for women at a particular pay grade. But titles are what survive in the record. And when historians 2 generations later go looking for the people who broke the codes, they find the titles, not the work. 5. Modern implications and questions. In 2016, a declassified NSA document from the 1990s became available to researchers. It was a study of the history of women in American cryptology, commissioned internally, written by NSA historian Betsy Rohaley Smoot. The study documented, with the careful restraint of official institutional prose, a history of systematic undervaluation that spanned the entire existence of the American signals intelligence enterprise from its beginnings in the 1920s through the post-war era. Women had been hired when men were unavailable or insufficient. They had been paid less for equivalent work at virtually every period and in virtually every capacity. They had been passed over for promotions that were given to men who had been trained by those same women, and they had been, upon separation from service, given certificates of appreciation that thanked them for their service, without specifying what that service had consisted of, because what it had consisted of was still classified. The document was careful. It did not editorialize. It presented the pattern and let the pattern speak for itself. But what the pattern speaks, when you listen to it carefully across the breadth of the evidence now available, is something more than a story of institutional sexism, important as that framing is. It speaks to something about the relationship between visibility and value, about how a society comes to know what it knows, and about how the things it does not know become structured absences rather than random gaps. We are now in an era in which the decryption of historical silence has become, in certain limited respects, a kind of growth industry. The biography of Elizebeth Friedman was a commercial and critical success. The contributions of Dorothy Braden Bruce, one of the many women who worked on Japanese codes at Arlington Hall, were documented by Liza Mundy in her 2017 book Code Girls, which examined the collective story of the American women codebreakers and became, for a brief period, a genuine popular success. There are now school curricula that include Bletchley Park and, in some of the better designed versions, the women who worked there. There are memorials. There is gradually a counter-narrative forming, but it is worth asking what it means that the counter-narrative took 80 years to form. It is worth asking what other silences of similar depth and duration are still in the process of being broken open. The Second World War codebreakers are in some ways an ideal case for this kind of historical recovery. because the ultimate declassification of the relevant files makes the recovery possible in a way that is not available for silences that do not have archives behind them. Most of the invisible work of history does not have an archive. Most of it existed only in the memories of people who have died, or in the informal social knowledge of communities that did not write things down, or in the institutional records of organizations that did not survive. The women of Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall and the Naval Communications Annex are recoverable because they were part of a bureaucratic state that kept records. Their names appear in payroll files, in personnel records, in the administrative documentation of institutions that measured and tracked their employees with the thoroughness of wartime necessity. The recovery of their contributions has been possible because the state that employed them also, in its meticulous way, documented their existence. Other silences do not have this institutional infrastructure behind them. Other invisible contributions of women, of colonized peoples, of the laborers and the administrators and the maintainers of every system on which the visible achievements of history rested, may be irrecoverable. What we can say about the women codebreakers of the Second World War is this: they existed, they did the work mattered enormously, and for decades the civilization they helped to save did not know their names. The civilization was not unusual in this. Civilizations routinely do not know the names of the people who saved them, because the mechanisms of recognition are themselves products of the social structures that the people who most needed saving were challenging. It is circular. It is not conspiratorial. It is simply the way that power has always organized the story of itself. But the story can be reorganized. It is being reorganized. Slowly, imperfectly, and with the inevitable frustration that comes from trying to recover what was lost, rather than simply preserving what was known. But it is being reorganized nonetheless. Mavis Beatty, the 19-year-old who broke the Italian Enigma cipher and helped make possible the victory at Cape Matapan, gave an interview late in her life in which she was asked what she thought about the fact that most people had never heard of her. She said, in the quiet way of someone who has had decades to reach a conclusion about something, that she had never done the work for recognition. She had done it because it needed doing, and because she was capable of doing it, and because the world she lived in was in danger, and that seemed at the time like a sufficient reason. That is one kind of answer. It is an honest and admirable one, but it is not a sufficient answer for the rest of us. For the people who inherited the world that she and the thousands of women like her helped to preserve, and who have been reading the history books that did not contain their names. Because recognition is not only for the people who are recognized, it is for the people who do the recognizing. It shapes what they understand to be possible. It shapes what they believe themselves capable of. It shapes the implicit models of intellectual achievement and institutional contribution that sit beneath conscious thought and determine what aspirations feel realistic, what ambitions feel presumptuous, what kinds of work seem worth doing. When Agnes Driscoll's obituary described her as a government worker, it did not merely fail her. It told every woman who read that obituary something specific about the relationship between extraordinary intellectual achievement and the institutional recognition it could expect. That message was not in the words. It was in the gap between the words and what they should have said. And gaps speak if you know how to read them. Elizebeth Friedman died in 1980. Her personal papers, containing the meticulous records she had kept of her own work, the records she had preserved precisely because she knew the institutional record would not do it for her, waited 17 more years before scholars began to examine them seriously. She knew, when she donated those papers, that the world was not yet ready to hear the story they contained. She donated them anyway. She trusted that eventually someone would be ready. She trusted that the archive would outlast the silence. She was right. The archive outlasted the silence. The question that her story and the stories of all the women who worked alongside her leave with us. The question that should, in an honest accounting, keep us somewhat uncomfortable, is how many other silences are still waiting for their archives to be opened. How many stories are sitting in collections that no one has yet thought to examine seriously, because the social structures that made the contribution invisible are still in their residue, making the recovery feel unnecessary. The women of the wartime code-breaking enterprise were not extraordinary in the sense of being unlike other women of their generation. They were extraordinary in the sense that they were given an opportunity, an unusual, historically peculiar wartime opportunity, to do work that was genuinely consequential, and they did it with a brilliance that the subsequent record, when finally examined, could not entirely conceal. There were 10,000 of them, 10,000 Mavis Battleys and Elizebeth Friedmans and Agnes Driscolls and Genevieve Grotjans, in varying degrees of contribution and varying degrees of obscurity. Most of them went home when the war ended. Most of them signed their secrecy agreements and went back to the lives that were waiting for them. Lives as wives and mothers and teachers and librarians. Lives that the social logic of the post-war era prescribed for them. Lives that gave almost no indication of what they had spent 4 years doing in windowless rooms in Virginia and Buckinghamshire. They did not talk about it. Some of them told their husbands, some did not. Some of their children knew, in vague outline, most did not. They carried the knowledge of what they had done the way you carry a great weight for a long time, until it becomes so familiar that you forget it is there, and then one day you set it down, and you realize how much of your life you spent carrying it. The weight they carried was not only the weight of secrecy, it was the weight of knowing that the thing you had done was real and important, and that the world you lived in was going to spend the rest of your life pretending otherwise. That is a particular kind of burden. It is not the worst burden that history has assigned to human beings, but it is a real one, and it deserves at minimum the recognition that would have made it unnecessary. Their names are Elizebeth Smith Friedman, Agnes Meyer Driscoll, Mavis Lever Beatty, Margaret Rock, Genevieve Grotjan Feinstein, Anne Cara Christie, Dorothy Braden Bruce, and 10,000 others whose names are in the payroll records of the National Security Agency and the Government Code and Cipher School, and who have not yet had their biographies written. The silence that surrounded their work was not eternal. It was temporal. It was the product of specific decisions, specific institutions, specific social arrangements that have since shifted enough to allow the recovery to begin. But recovery is not the same as justice. Recovery is the beginning of the conversation that justice requires, and that conversation about what was lost, about what the loss cost us, about what it means to build a civilization on the invisible labor of people it will not name, is one that we are still, 80 years later, only beginning to have. The machines are silent now. The buildings where they worked have been repurposed or demolished or turned into museums where the machines are displayed as artifacts, and the visitors move through them taking photographs of devices whose operation they do not understand, without knowing the names of the people who understood them best. The war is over. The urgency is gone. All that remains is the record, and what we choose to do with it. The record says they were there. The record says the work was done. The record says the silence was imposed and maintained and eventually broken, but broken slowly, imperfectly, and at a cost measured in lives that were lived without acknowledgement of what they had accomplished. What we do with that record is not a historical question. It is a present one. It is a question about what kind of civilization we are choosing to be, and about whether we are capable of learning from the silences of the past, how to listen for the silences of the present before they become the history of the future. The women of the silent war built their monument in codes that have since been broken. The monument was always there. We simply needed, finally, to learn how to read it.